Hello there, it's Silver. This is Fantasian Neo Dimension. So first off, a big thanks to Square Enix for sending over a key so that I could take a look at this. This is a JRPG, and it's a JRPG in a very classic sense. It feels like an older sort of PS1 era JRPG for the most part. I would say if you're a fan of games like, say, Bravely Default or Octopath Traveler, modern JRPGs that are aping more earlier like Final Fantasy IX era games, then I think this will probably be up your alley. So the first thing to talk about is how it looks, and speaking of old school, it has a very old school appearance. It definitely looks like a sort of modernized PS1 JRPG to me. It uses these pre-rendered backgrounds that have a really interesting appearance to them. They remind me of like Final Fantasy IX and X backgrounds mixed with something like Myst or Riven pre-rendered backgrounds. So there are these really detailed, nice-looking, almost photorealistic-esque backgrounds with this like highly stylized anime character models and things, and these super colorful enemy models that all are very reminiscent of an older school of JRPG that has sort of gone by. And honestly, the music fits this as well, although the game also has kind of a cool feature in which you can change the battle music to other games, including stuff like the Final Fantasy VII Remake or Final Fantasy XVI battle music. So there's a good sort of pedigree here in terms of the audio-visual style and what it's going for, and I think it actually nails it pretty well. It's got a really interesting look to it that is reminiscent of a type of game that we don't really see as much anymore. Plot-wise, in this game you play as someone that has amnesia, although unlike the usual amnesia plot, in this case they remember fragments of stuff, and as you go through the game they will remember more and more fragments until eventually about halfway through the game or so they regain their full memory. But the main thing is there is multi-world travel going on here, and they're sort of stuck currently in this Earth-like human world that has this strange mechanical disease spreading through it called Mechteria. And this disease basically takes all of the emotion and willpower of people who are exposed to it until eventually it will kill them, leaving them a sort of drained out husk. And the idea is there's something going on with this harvesting of emotion, and it's happening for a reason. In fact, there is actually a specific individual that's behind this Mechteria, and it's sort of your job to figure out why it exists and what it's being used for. And as you go through the game, you'll find that there is like multi-dimensional travel going on here. At first, you'll be stuck in this traditional like fantasy dimension with a little bit of modern stuff going on. You know, very much like a Final Fantasy 8 through 10 kind of science fantasy-ish setting. But then eventually you'll be able to explore other dimensions, including a mechanical realm that has pretty much been taken over entirely by machines, and a chaos realm that was taken over entirely by this weird chaotic growth stuff that kind of makes the entire place look organic. And eventually even the realm of the gods themselves. This is a party-based JRPG, so even though you have a main character, there are lots of other characters that you'll come across that you will add to your party. You'll be switching in and out characters a lot for the first half of the game, and then after the second half big reveals and stuff happen, then you'll have more of a constant number of people that you can switch in and out at your will. You can have up to 3 in a battle at any given time, but you'll have significantly more than 3 total. This is the kind of traditional system where characters learn new skills and spells and things simply by leveling up, so there isn't any like Mechteria or skill gem like system. Instead, you just level up and learn new stuff that way. However, that only accounts for about half of a character's total number of learnable skills, because after that halfway point in the game, the characters will start getting these divine artifacts that will empower them in various ways, and also once they have this artifact, they unlock a character-specific skill tree that you can spend level up points on to actually go through and learn various active and passive skills that way. So at first, throughout the first half of the game, you'll be learning exclusively by leveling up, but once you cross that big threshold and things open up, then you'll also have these skill trees to look through. The battle system here has a couple of interesting mechanics that I've never really seen before. So for one, you'll be often encountering a large number of enemies per battle, sometimes only 2 or 3, sometimes up to like 10. And all of your character's skills actually have shapes that they affect. So everyone has a basic attack that only hits one enemy, although there are some characters that can also pierce enemies with their attacks, so they can hit multiple in a line. But also, a lot of their skills have a shape. So some of your characters will have skills that target everything in a straight line, so you can move this line around to try and hit as many enemies as possible in one go. There are also spells, and the interesting thing about spells is they can be curved, so you can actually hit enemies in irregular shapes with spells by curving them around and trying to catch as many as possible. This means that the combat is all about efficiently using your MP, your skills, to hit as many enemies as you can at once, and sort of, depending on what area the character is in, like which of the 3 slots they're in, determines what angles of attack they have at the groups of enemies. So you've got to try and make everything work as much as possible. Because you'll be outnumbered all the time, you'll be facing pretty large numbers of enemies, it's about efficiently taking care of groups as much as you can. But another interesting mechanic here is the Dimengeon. You have this thing that kind of looks like a Roomba called a Dimengeon machine, and this is the reason that the encounter rate in this game is quite high. This game does have random encounters. You don't encounter enemy symbols, you actually just randomly have fights. And I would say the random encounter rate in this game is much higher than the average for a JRPG, but you have the Dimengeon, and the Dimengeon makes it to where you can seal enemies away into it whenever you encounter them. So as you're exploring the world, you won't have to fight every encounter individually. Instead, you can seal the enemies that you would have encountered into it up to a certain limit, which at first is 30, but can be expanded to 40. I'm not sure if it can go higher than that. But and then whenever you want, you can choose to dive into the Dimengeon yourself and fight all of the enemies in it at once. So the upside to this means that the higher encounter rate, it doesn't really constitute a problem because you're not fighting every encounter individually as soon as it happens. You're storing them up for later. The downside, potentially, is that you have to fight all of the monsters in it at one time. So if you have it full of 30 monsters, then your next fight with it is going to be 30 monsters all at once, which is kind of a lot to deal with, but it does also mean that you get a bunch of experience and stuff. So this is an interesting kind of JRPG that's not really about individual small fights, but rather about saving up for one larger fight every now and then. Fighting in the Dimengeon also gives you some extra benefits as opposed to just fighting in the field, one of which is that just because there's so many enemies densely on the field, all of your shaped attacks have a better chance of hitting a bunch of enemies at once because there's just more of them. But also there will be these crystals that are placed throughout the field that you can hit with piercing attacks and things to get various effects. You might get an extra turn, or get a party-wide attack buff, or get a revival, or get a remedy that cures everyone's status ailments. There are all sorts of them. So you do have sort of a home field advantage, you could say, when fighting in the Dimengeon to balance out the fact that you're heavily outnumbered. I think this is a pretty cool combat system. It's actually a lot of fun to line up enemies for a really satisfying piercing attack that hits like 8 of them at once. And this also makes boss fights really difficult, but really enjoyable most of the time because they're allowed to have all sorts of different adds and a big field to deal with and all these shaped attacks and stuff, so they can be kind of complex. And all of this extra complexity means that there's quite a lot of variety in terms of the boss battles and the mechanics that they use and how you're expected to beat them. Every character has several different equipment slots. They've got a weapon slot, and each character uses weapons that are specific to them. There is no like cross-compatibility. They've also got an armor slot, and armor can be equipped by anyone. And then they have a gem slot, and gems are things that you'll find and sometimes make throughout the game that have various powerful passive effects. And also, once you get access to their skill trees, you can unlock more jewel slots as well. Once you get a certain way through the story, each character will also have a divine artifact slot that they can equip that will give them some benefits as well as giving them access to their skill tree. And there will also be some sort of side missions or sometimes story missions, depending on the character, that allow you to empower this artifact that'll increase whatever it does and gives them some extra benefits. Each character also has their own list of techniques and skills that they'll learn, and they're all very different from each other. Like the main character learns various elemental slash types and this one single target multi-slash hitting attack that can be enchanted with different elements and things as you go along. It's very powerful but costs a lot to use. Then you've got, say, characters that mostly use magic of various elements, characters that can buff or debuff, characters that can combine different consumable items with each other to create new effects. There are quite a few different types of character, you could say, and each person has their own role to play, so this means there's a good amount of combat variety. Exploration is very important in this game. In classic JRPG style, you'll be going through all sorts of different dungeons and field areas and things. There are lots and lots of them, so there's plenty to explore. You'll also find lots of treasure chests around the place, and these you definitely want to open because they can often have some really good stuff in them, but the main things are the locked treasure chests. There are several different types of locked chests that you'll find in dungeons and safe areas and towns all over the place, and you want to remember where all of these are because the keys for each kind are specific to that type, so there are several different keys keys that you can find, and some of these keys will be way late into the game before you can actually get access to them, but these chests have extremely good stuff in them, and it is always worth remembering exactly where they are so that once you do finally get access to that particular type of key, you can remember where they were and go back and get them, because they'll often have better weapons and gear and stuff in them than you can otherwise get anywhere else. Pretty much every major field area and dungeon does end in a boss fight, and the boss fights in this game are quite challenging, I would say. I would say overall this game's difficulty is on the higher, like medium higher end of JRPGs. It's not super crushingly hard, it's not like Shin Megami Tensei hard, but it is quite difficult. And especially in the latter half of the game, the boss fights get kind of mean-spirited. They get really, really hard. I think the main idea is that roughly in the first half, because you don't have as much flexibility as to what your characters can do yet, the boss fights are a bit more general. Like, as long as you have a fair strategy, you can probably beat them. Whereas in the second half of the game, the boss fights turn into, there is one specific strategy that you're intended to use, and if you don't use it, you're going to die almost guaranteed. So the latter half boss fights kind of turn into more like puzzle bosses, basically. And I think because of the flexibility and interesting mechanics of this particular combat system, that works. You know, that's actually a fine way to design the bosses because of the way the combat mechanics work. It makes sense, and it allows you to come up with these strategies that are viable for specific bosses and see if you can beat them that way. Story-wise, without any spoilers, it's got some pretty interesting points that go in some relatively unusual places, including trying to humanize the godlike villains and stuff at a certain point to make them a little bit less of just inherently pure evil and more sympathetic in certain ways. And I think it's always fun to try to humanize really significant villains like that, because it makes them more interesting than just, I want to take over the world, come and beat me. They're a little bit more nuanced than that, which is always nice. And the characters that you're actually traveling with all have their own stories and their own side quests and things to help develop them and give them some more character throughout the story, which is definitely a good idea, especially because you tie these bits of individual character development with empowering their own divine artifacts and learning more about them so that they work together, which is a good idea, I think. Overall, I've had a lot of fun with Fantasian, and I think it's kind of a shame that I'm not hearing more about it. This is a JRPG that's kind of flying under the radar right now. Like, people know about it-ish, but not all that well, it seems. And I haven't seen all that many high-profile reviews of it or anything. It seems like it's kind of stealthing under people's notice right now, and I think it deserves a little bit more than that, because it's actually a pretty interesting game, and it's a lot of fun to go through, and has some really neat combat mechanics and things that make it a little bit different. And it's also just cool to see a JRPG going for this older school style that is like PS1 to early PS2 era kind of vibe. You know, we see lots of JRPGs going for the 8 and 16-bit eras, and we see lots of new ones, but we don't see as many going for this style, so it's cool to see. I've definitely had some fun with it, and it's definitely worth completing as well, because the story does go some interesting places, and there's good resolution for the character arcs and stuff that makes it satisfying to complete. So yeah, I definitely recommend it. I think it's a solid title, and it's kind of a shame that it's flying under the radar so much, but hopefully it'll be kind of a cult hit as time goes on and people discover that it's actually quite good. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Fantasian Neo Dimension if you guys wish to check it out yourselves. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.